What if everything you thought you knew about ancient death rituals was only half the story? We talk about mummies, we talk about pyramids, we talk about the afterlife. But nobody talks about what these rituals actually tell us about how ancient people understood the self, the soul, the terrifying, mysterious gap between who we are when we are alive and where we go when we stop breathing. Today, we are going inside three of the most powerful civilizations ever to walk this earth: ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, and ancient China. And we are not just going to compare their funeral rites. We are going to uncover the hidden philosophy underneath every ritual, the fear, the love, the theology, and the desperate human need to believe that death is not the end. Because here is the thing that nobody tells you. These three civilizations, thousands of miles apart, developing completely independently of each other, came to some of the most startling similar conclusions about what happens after we die. And the differences, the places where they diverge, reveal something even more fascinating about the human soul. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will not look at death the same way. And before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome to First Beliefs. This channel exists to take you into the sacred history of humanity, the ancient religions, the buried philosophies, the spiritual truths that have shaped every civilization you have ever read about. If that is the kind of content that speaks to you, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, because this is the kind of journey that is best taken together. Now, let us begin. Before we can understand any single ritual, we have to understand something foundational. Ancient people did not think about death the way we do. We live in a world that is largely uncomfortable with death. We hide it in hospitals. We euphemize it in language. We treat it as a problem to be solved by medicine, by technology, by denial. And when none of that works, we treat it as the ultimate loss, the end of the story, full stop. Ancient people had a radically different relationship with death. For them, death was not the end of the story. It was a transition, a journey, a doorway into another state of being that was in many ways more real, more permanent than the fragile mortal life we live on this side of the veil. And here is what is so remarkable. This belief that death is a passage, not an ending, appears independently in Egyptian theology, in Roman religious thought, and in the spiritual philosophy of ancient China. Three civilizations, three entirely different mythologies, three completely different geographies, and yet all three arrived at essentially the same conclusion. The self does not end at death. It transforms. Now, what they believe that transformation looked like, that is where things get fascinating and deeply, deeply different. In ancient Egypt, the self was imagined as something so complex it could not be contained in a single word. The Egyptians believed a human being had multiple spiritual components: the Ba, the Ka, the Akh, the Ren, the shadow, each one representing a different aspect of personhood that needed to survive death in a different way. This is not superstition. This is sophisticated metaphysics. In ancient Rome, the picture was somewhat different. The Romans were deeply influenced by Greek thought, particularly by the concept of the manes, the divine spirits of the deceased, and by a complex interplay between Roman state religion, mystery cults like those of Orphism and later Mithraism, and the deeply personal family-centered rituals that governed how the dead were remembered, honored, and kept alive in the world of the living. In ancient China, the understanding of death was rooted in a worldview that saw the universe as a dynamic balance between opposing forces, yin and yang, light and dark, the living and the dead, and in the profound conviction that the bonds between the living and the dead did not dissolve at the moment of death. They continued. They had obligations in both directions. These are three different architectures of the soul, and the rituals each civilization developed were not arbitrary customs, they were technologies. Spiritual technologies designed to navigate those architectures, to protect the dead, to honor their journey, and to keep the living connected to something larger than themselves. Let us start with Egypt, because Egypt is where the story gets ancient, and where it gets strange, and where it gets, in the most profound sense, beautiful. Egypt. The word itself conjures something. Pyramids rising from golden sand, the inscrutable gaze of the Sphinx, tombs painted in vivid color, sealed for 3,000 years, waiting. But what is the story underneath those images? What was Egypt actually doing with death? What did they believe, and why did they invest so much architecture, so much artistry, so much of their entire civilization in the project of preserving the dead? The answer starts with a word you have probably heard, Ka. The Ka was, in Egyptian thought, something like the vital life force, the animating energy that made a person alive. When you were born, your Ka came into existence. When you died, your Ka was released from your body, but it did not disappear. It continued to exist. And here is the key. It needed somewhere to return to. This is why mummification was so essential. The mummified body was not just a preserved corpse. It was an anchor, a home base, a physical location to which the Ka could return to be nourished through offerings of food, of incense, of prayer. But the Ka was only one part of the picture. There was also the Ba. If the Ka was the life force, the Ba was something closer to what we might call the personality, the unique individual essence of a specific person. The Ba is often depicted in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, and that image is deeply intentional, because after death, the Ba could fly. It could move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. During the day, it might visit familiar places, the home where the person had lived, the garden they had loved. At night, it would return to the mummy to rest. And then there was the Akh. The Akh was what the Ba and the Ka became when they were successfully united after death, a transfigured, luminous being capable of existing in the afterlife and under the right circumstances of intervening in the world of the living as an ancestor spirit. There were other components too. The Ren, which was the name, understood as so fundamental to identity that destroying a person's name could erase their existence. The Shot, the shadow, the Ib, the heart. The heart was so important that in the central ritual of Egyptian death theology, the weighing of the heart, it was literally placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. Let us talk about that ritual, because it is one of the most extraordinary concepts in all of human religious history. The weighing of the heart, depicted in the famous papyrus of Ani, a copy of the Book of the Dead dating to approximately 1375 BCE, though the texts it contains are much older, shows the deceased standing in the Hall of Two Truths before Osiris, the god of the dead. The deceased's heart is placed on one side of a great scale On the other side sits the feather of Maat. If the heart was heavy, burdened by sin, by wrongdoing, by the weight of a life lived badly, it would not balance the feather, and then Ammit would come. Ammit, the devourer, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, would eat the heart. And that would be the second death. Not just the death of the body, but the obliteration of the soul. Permanent erasure. But if the heart was light, if the person had lived in accordance with Ma'at, had spoken truth, had not stolen or murdered or coveted, had been generous, kind, just the heart would balance the feather, and the deceased would be welcomed into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a green, abundant, eternally beautiful land where the soul would live forever in a state of peaceful joy. Before the weighing, the deceased had to make what Egyptologists call the negative confession, a declaration of all the wrongs they had not committed, spoken before 42 divine judges. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not spoken lies, I have not caused suffering, I have not been greedy, I have not acted with violence. 42 statements of moral innocence, each one addressed to a different divine assessor. This is not a primitive superstition. This is a fully developed ethical system embedded in the architecture of death. The message is this: how you live determines what happens to you after you die. Death is not the end of moral accountability. It is the culmination of it. Now, the rituals that surrounded physical death and burial were extraordinarily elaborate. Mummification, the process of preserving the body so the Ka could return, took 70 days. 70. The embalmers were specialists, a priestly caste who worked in a designated place called the Beautiful House. They followed detailed procedures, removing the organs, drying the body with natron salt, wrapping it in linen bandages inscribed with protective spells, replacing the organs in canopic jars guarded by the four sons of Horus. The brain, interestingly, was not preserved. It was removed through the nostril using a metal hook and discarded. The Egyptians believed thought happened in the heart, not the brain, so the brain was considered disposable. The heart, by contrast, was left inside the body, or in some periods replaced with a scarab amulet, because it was the heart that would be judged. The funeral itself involved complex rituals, including the opening of the mouth ceremony, in which a priest, using a special instrument called an adze, touched the mummy's mouth, eyes, and ears to restore the senses and allow the deceased to eat, see, hear, and speak in the afterlife. And then there was the tomb. Not just a burial place, a house for eternity. The wealthy built elaborate tombs filled with furniture, clothing, food, tools, games, jewelry, everything they might need in the next world. The walls were covered with paintings not of grief, but of life, feasts, music, hunting, family, beauty, because the intention was not to mourn the dead, but to provide for them. In the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs, carved into the rock of the Valley of the Kings, entire theological treatises were painted across the walls. The Book of the Dead, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, detailed maps of the journey through the underworld, guides through the 12 hours of the night, instructions for navigating the dangers of the Duat, the Egyptian realm of the dead. The Duat was not simply a destination. It was a landscape, a journey. The deceased had to travel through 12 gates, each guarded by serpents and gods, each requiring specific knowledge, specific passwords, specific spells to pass through. This is why the Book of the Dead existed, to give the deceased the knowledge they needed to survive the journey and reach the field of reeds. And here is something that almost nobody talks about when they talk about Egyptian death rituals. The whole system was, at its heart, deeply democratic in aspiration, even if not in practice. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, the Old Kingdom, roughly 2600 to 2100 BCE, the elaborate afterlife was reserved almost entirely for the pharaoh. He was the only one who was guaranteed eternal life. Everyone else was dependent on proximity to him. But over the centuries, something extraordinary happened. The theology democratized. By the Middle Kingdom, ordinary people, not just pharaohs, not just nobles, began to have access to the spells, the rituals, the protections of the afterlife. The coffin texts inscribed on the coffins of ordinary officials gave middle-class Egyptians access to the same protective knowledge previously reserved for royalty. And by the New Kingdom, the Book of the Dead was available to anyone who could afford a copy, a papyrus scroll purchased from temple scribes, personalized with the buyer's name. The message was spreading. The afterlife is not just for kings. Every soul deserves a judgment. Every heart deserves to be weighed. Every person who has lived in truth deserves to live in paradise. That is a remarkable moral development. And it happened over more than 1,000 years through the theology of death. One more thing before we leave Egypt, and it is something I find deeply moving. The Egyptians had a concept called Sahu, the spiritual body that the deceased would inhabit in the afterlife. And they believed that one of the most important things the living could do for the dead was to speak their name, to say their name aloud, because as long as someone spoke your name, you were not truly gone. You continued to exist, carried in the breath and voice of those who remembered you. Think about that. Think about what it means. The greatest act of love you could perform for someone who had died was simply to say their name, to keep them alive in language, to refuse to let them be forgotten. There is a line in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, one of the oldest texts in human history, that has stayed with me since I first read it. It says, approximately, "My heart is with me, and it shall not be taken away," a declaration, a protest against erasure, a refusal to be diminished even in death. That line is over 3,000 years old, and it still sounds like something a living person would say. Let us cross the Mediterranean now. Let us come forward in time, though not as far forward as it might seem. And let us enter a world that looks very different from Egypt on the surface, but which, if you look carefully, is animated by some of the same deep fears, the same deep loves. Rome, the world's most famous empire, military genius, legal innovation, roads that still exist, aqueducts that still function, a civilization so dominant that its language became the root of half the languages of Europe, and its religious calendar shaped the Christian liturgical year. But what did Rome believe about death? What happened in Roman thought when you stopped breathing? The answer involves a word that most people have heard but few understand: manes. The manes, pronounced approximately manes, were the spirits of the dead. In Roman religion, every person who died became one of the manes. They were divine. The Roman term was demanes, the divine dead, and they were understood as existing in a collective, generalized realm beneath the earth, while also maintaining a specific connection to their family and to the physical place where they were buried. This is the first thing to understand about Roman death theology. The dead did not leave. They were present. They remained in relationship with the living. And those relationships had obligations on both sides. The living owed the dead proper burial, regular offerings, and remembrance. This was not optional. It was a religious duty, and more than that, it was a social duty. A family that failed to honor its dead was a family without integrity. A person who died without proper burial was considered dangerously unsettled, a restless spirit, a potential threat to the living. This is where Roman death ritual starts, and it starts with the body. When a Roman died, the body was prepared in the home, washed, anointed with oil, dressed in the toga or other appropriate garment, and laid out for a period of mourning called the conclamatio. Family members would gather and call out the name of the deceased, loudly, repeatedly, in a ritual that was both a farewell and a final check to ensure the person was truly dead and not merely in a coma. The calling of the name. Sound familiar? For wealthier Romans, the funeral procession, the pompa funebris, was a major public event. The body was carried through the streets on a bier, accompanied by professional mourners, women who were paid to weep and tear their hair and garments, musicians playing pipes and horns, and, in the case of aristocratic families, actors wearing the wax masks of the family's distinguished ancestors, dressed in the appropriate senatorial robes or military regalia. The ancestors were literally present at the funeral, embodied by performers. The dead were escorting the newly dead. At the forum for important figures, there would be a funeral oration, the Laudatio Funebris, in which the deceased's achievements were recounted and their virtues praised. This was both a tribute to the individual and a public assertion of the family's honor, its history, its continuity. Then came burial or cremation. Roman practice shifted dramatically over the centuries. In the Republican period, cremation was common among the nobility. The ashes were placed in an urn and interred in a family tomb. In the imperial period, inhumation, actual burial of the body, became increasingly common, influenced partly by Eastern religious practices, including, eventually, Christianity. But the burial was not the end of Rome's obligations to the dead. Far from it. Roman religion included a calendar of festivals dedicated to the dead, and the most important of these was the Parentalia, 9 days in February during which the living honored their deceased ancestors with offerings at their tombs. The offerings were simple: a garland of flowers, a sprinkling of grain, a few pinches of salt, some wine-soaked bread, violets. The message was not the material value of the gift, but the act of remembrance itself. During the Parentalia, temples were closed, marriages were forbidden, public business was suspended. The whole city entered a kind of sacred pause to turn its attention toward the dead. And on the final day of the Parentalia came the Feralia, the day of the dead proper, when offerings were made at the tombs and the manes of all the deceased were collectively honored. The following day, the Charistia, was a family feast among the living, a celebration of the bonds of kinship that persisted beyond death. There was also the Lemuria, 3 nights in May, the 9th, 11th, and 13th, dedicated to the Lemures, the restless or malevolent spirits of those who had died violently before their time or without proper burial. The Lemures were dangerous. They could haunt the living, cause illness, disturb sleep, bring misfortune. On the nights of the Lemuria, The paterfamilias, the male head of the household, would rise at midnight, wash his hands, and walk barefoot through the house, making a specific gesture, snapping his fingers, possibly to drive away spirits while throwing black beans over his shoulder. Beans, which the Romans associated with the dead, 9 times, repeating the words, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." Then he would wash his hands again, strike bronze vessels together, and repeat 9 times, "Ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone." This ritual is extraordinary. It tells us something essential about Roman belief. The dead are near. The boundary between the living and the dead is porous. And while the well-tended dead are benevolent ancestors, the neglected dead, the ones who died badly, who were not honored, can become a danger. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century BCE, explained the mythology of the Lemuria by connecting it to the ghost of Remus, the twin brother of Romulus, who was killed by his brother during the founding of Rome. An inauspicious beginning, a founding haunted by fratricide. And the rituals that grew around that ghost tell us something about the Roman psyche. The guilt of the past can possess the present. The dead demand their due. Now, alongside the official Roman state religion of the Manes and the Dei Inferi, the gods of the underworld, including Dispater, Proserpina, and Hecate, there existed a rich and complex undergrowth of mystery cults and philosophical traditions that offered deeper, more personal frameworks for understanding death and what came after. The Eleusinian mysteries, originally Greek but deeply absorbed into Roman spiritual life, promised initiates a blessed afterlife, a vision of the underworld, and a secret knowledge of what awaited the soul beyond death. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators and philosophers, wrote that the mysteries had given him not only a reason to live joyfully, but a reason to die without fear. The Orphic tradition offered a different vision, a mythology of the soul cycle through multiple incarnations, with the eventual possibility of release from the wheel of rebirth and union with the divine. Gold tablets found in graves across the ancient Mediterranean world, the so-called Orphic gold tablets, contain instructions for the soul in the underworld. Remember where to walk, remember what to say, do not drink from the river of forgetfulness, drink instead from the spring of memory. And then, of course, there was Epicurean philosophy, which offered a completely different answer. Death is simply the cessation of sensation, and therefore there is nothing to fear. As Epicurus himself put it, and here the philosophy almost becomes a kind of secular comfort theology. When death is, I am not. When I am, death is not. The soul does not survive the body. There is no afterlife judgment. There is no continuation. There is only the present moment, and the fact that death cannot touch what does not yet exist. This diversity, official religion, mystery cults, philosophical schools, all coexisting, overlapping, arguing, and sometimes fusing, is one of the most distinctive features of Roman spiritual life. Rome was not a monolithic theological system. It was a vast, complicated, often contradictory conversation about what it meant to be human, to die, and to hope. And through all of it ran one constant thread: the dead are not gone. They are here. They are watching. They are owed something. And the quality of our relationship with them shapes the quality of our lives. That is the Roman answer. Now we travel farther east, farther in time, and farther in geography. We come to a civilization that developed almost entirely in isolation from both Egypt and Rome, and yet which produced a theology of death that resonates in deep and surprising ways with both ancient China. I want to be clear about what we are talking about when we say ancient China in this context. We are primarily drawing on the traditions of the Shang dynasty, roughly 1750 to 1046 BCE, when ancestor veneration was already a highly developed and institutionalized practice. The Zhou dynasty, which followed, and the broader world of early Chinese thought that includes Confucianism, Taoism, and the complex interplay between official religious practice and popular belief. We are talking about a civilization that has been continuously practicing some form of ancestor veneration for over 3,000 years, possibly longer. Let us start with the fundamental belief. In ancient Chinese cosmology, the universe is animated by a vital force called qi, a concept so fundamental to Chinese thought that it underlies everything from traditional medicine to martial arts to architecture to the understanding of death. Qi is not quite energy and not quite spirit and not quite matter. It is all of these and none of them, the animating principle of existence itself. When a person died, their qi did not simply disappear, it dispersed. The yang component, the bright, active, masculine aspect of the qi, rose upward toward heaven, where it eventually dissipated or was absorbed into the cosmic order. The yin component, the dark, receptive, feminine, earthly aspect, descended into the earth, where it remained associated with the bones, with the grave, with the physical location of burial. But here is the crucial point. The spirit of the ancestor, the Han, associated with the yang component, could be called back, could be invited to dwell in a specific place, an ancestral tablet, a memorial shrine, and could be maintained there through regular offerings, through ritual attention, through the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The ancestral tablet was a small wooden plaque inscribed with the name and birth and death dates of the deceased, which was placed in the family ancestral shrine. This tablet was understood not merely as a symbol of the ancestor, but as a dwelling place for the ancestor's spirit. When the family performed rituals before the tablet, burning incense, offering food, pouring libations of wine, bowing in reverence, they were not performing a symbolic act. They were feeding a real presence. This is ancestor veneration. And in ancient China, it was not optional, not peripheral, not a private spiritual preference. It was the foundation of family life, of social order, of cosmic stability. The philosopher Confucius, writing in the 5th century BCE, placed filial piety, xiao, the reverence and care owed to parents and ancestors, at the absolute center of his ethical system. The family in Confucian thought was not just a social unit, it was the basic unit of moral training, the school in which every virtue was first learned, and the family extended beyond death. The dead parents remained parents, the dead grandparents remained grandparents. The obligations of children to parents did not end at the grave, they intensified at the grave, because now the parent was utterly dependent on the child's ritual attention for their continued well-being in the spirit world. This created what we might call a reciprocal cosmology of care. The living cared for the dead through ritual. The dead, in turn, cared for the living through blessing, through protection, through the accumulated spiritual merit of a well-tended relationship. Ancestors who were properly honored became benevolent protectors of the family line. Ancestors who were neglected or who had died badly without proper ritual, without sufficient mourning, could become hungry ghosts, wandering, resentful spirits capable of bringing misfortune, illness, and disaster upon the living. Now, let us look at the actual practices. When someone died in ancient China, the funeral process was extraordinarily elaborate, and the elaborateness was itself a moral statement. The more elaborate the funeral, the more clearly the family was demonstrating its respect for the deceased, its wealth and social standing, and its commitment to the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. The body was washed and dressed in multiple layers of clothing. The number of layers was carefully specified according to social rank. The deceased was placed in a coffin, and the coffin was left in the home for a mourning period that could last anywhere from 3 days for an ordinary person to 3 years for a son mourning a parent. During this period, family members were required to observe specific rules of mourning, wearing rough hemp garments rather than silk, refraining from music and entertainment, eating only plain food, wailing at specific times of day. The mourning period was not just an expression of grief. It was a structured, socially regulated performance of the depth of filial love, and its length and intensity were proportional to the closeness of the relationship. A son's mourning for his father was the most intensive, 3 years. A daughter's mourning for her parents, a husband's for his wife, a wife's for her husband, all specified, all regulated, all carrying social and moral weight. At the funeral, offerings were essential. Food, wine, clothing, paper money. In later periods, paper replicas of houses, horses, servants, vehicles, luxury goods were burned, the smoke carrying them into the spirit world where the deceased would need them. This practice of burning paper offerings, sometimes called joss paper or ghost money, is still practiced across Chinese communities around the world today, thousands of years after it began. Burial itself was preceded by elaborate divination to determine the correct location and orientation of the grave, a practice connected to feng shui, the ancient Chinese art of placement, which understood the landscape as a dynamic field of qi in which the orientation of a grave could affect not just the comfort of the deceased, but the fortune and prosperity of the entire family line for generations. This is remarkable. In ancient Chinese thought, where you buried your ancestor mattered cosmically. The bones of the ancestor, resting in a site of harmonious qi, would channel that energy beneficially toward the living descendants. A poorly located grave could cause the family's fortunes to decline. A well-located grave could bring prosperity for 100 generations. The tomb itself for the wealthy was often a miniature world, furnished with ceramic figures, servants, musicians, soldiers, horses, cooking implements, furniture, everything the deceased would need in the afterlife. The famous terracotta army of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, over 8,000 life-sized ceramic soldiers, horses, and chariots buried with the emperor in approximately 210 BCE, is the most extraordinary surviving example of this practice. An entire army frozen in clay, ready to serve the emperor in the next world. But even for ordinary families, the principle was the same. The dead need provision. The dead need care. The dead need to know they have not been forgotten. After the funeral, The relationship with the ancestor continued through regular ritual attention at the ancestral shrine. On important festival days, particularly the Qingming festival, which still falls in early April, families would visit the graves of their ancestors, clean and tend the tomb, burn offerings, and share a meal in the presence of the dead. This practice too persists today. Qingming is sometimes called Tomb Sweeping Day, and millions of Chinese families still observe it annually. There is something I find deeply moving about this. Generation after generation, for over 3,000 years, Chinese families have gone to the graves of their ancestors in early spring, cleared away the winter's debris, brought flowers and food and incense, and sat for a while in the presence of those who came before. Not out of obligation alone, or not only obligation, but out of love, out of the conviction that the dead are still kin, still present, still part of the family. The boundary between the living and the dead in this worldview is not a wall, it is a curtain. And the curtain can be parted with the right ritual attention, with the right love. One last thing about ancient Chinese death ritual that deserves our attention, the concept of the hungry ghost. The hungry ghost, the igui, was the spirit of someone who had died without proper ritual attention, without family to care for them, without anyone to perform the necessary offerings. They wandered, homeless, perpetually hungry, unable to receive the nourishment that properly honored spirits receive from their descendants. They were pitiful and they were dangerous. Out of their desperation, they might attach themselves to the living, bringing misfortune, illness, and bad luck. The Ghost Festival, the Hungry Ghost Festival, celebrated on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month, was originally a Buddhist adaptation of older Chinese ancestor practices, and it involved making offerings not just to one's own ancestors, but to all the wandering, unattended ghosts who had no family to care for them. Tables of food were set out in the streets. Paper offerings were burned for strangers. Lanterns were floated on water to guide the lost spirits home. The moral of the hungry ghost is profound. The spiritual consequences of neglect are real, not just for the dead, but for the living. A world in which some of the dead are cared for and some are not is a world in which the wandering, hungry, resentful dead will inevitably come into contact with the living. The solution is not to protect yourself from the unloved dead, it is to love them too. That is ancient Chinese wisdom, and it is thousands of years old. Now, let us step back. Let us look at these three civilizations side by side, because something remarkable emerges. Egypt, Rome, China. Three worlds, three mythologies, three geographies, three languages, three artistic traditions, and yet look at what they share. First, in all three civilizations, the dead are not gone. They remain present in relationship with the living. The Egyptian Ka returns to the mummy. The Roman manes inhabit a porous boundary between the living and the dead. The Chinese ancestor dwells in the wooden tablet, called back by ritual. Death does not sever the bond between the living and the dead. It changes it. Second, in all three civilizations, the living have obligations to the dead. Egyptian families brought food offerings to the tomb, maintained the mummy, spoke the name. Roman families celebrated the parentalia, tended the grave, made offerings at the threshold between worlds. Chinese families maintained the ancestral shrine, burned offerings, observed mourning protocols, visited graves at Qingming. The dead are not self-sufficient. They need us. Third, In all three civilizations, the failure to honor the dead has consequences. The poorly housed Egyptian Ka wanders restless and hungry. The neglected Roman lemures haunt the living, bringing misfortune. The Chinese hungry ghost causes illness and disaster. The message is consistent across three cultures. Neglect is dangerous. Love, expressed through ritual, is protective. Fourth, in all three civilizations, there is some form of moral judgment after death. The Egyptian weighing of the heart is the most explicit and detailed, a full trial before 42 divine judges, with the soul's fate determined by the moral weight of its life. But Roman tradition also included accounts of Tartarus and Elysium, places of punishment and reward in the underworld, particularly in philosophical literature like Virgil's Aeneid, which describes Aeneas's descent into the underworld and his encounter with the souls of the dead, some condemned to eternal torment, others resting in blissful fields. And in Chinese tradition, influenced strongly by Buddhist ideas that filtered in from India, the afterlife came to include its own system of judgment, the 10 courts of hell, where the soul was assessed and its next incarnation determined. The specific details differ enormously, but the underlying logic is the same. Death is not an escape from moral accountability. It is a reckoning with it. Fifth, and this is the one that moves me most, in all three civilizations, love is the substance of which ritual is made. The Egyptian who spoke a dead person's name, the Roman son who placed violets on his father's grave in February, the Chinese daughter who brought food to her mother's tablet and wept. These acts were not just performed out of fear of the dead or obligation to tradition, they were acts of love, imperfect, embodied, temporal love, reaching across the gap between the living and the dead, refusing to let go. Every culture in human history has developed rituals around death, every single one. There has never been a human society that did not have some way of marking death, honoring the dead, navigating the terrifying reality of mortality. This universality tells us something. It tells us that whatever death is, whatever is happening when consciousness ends and the body stills, human beings have been, since the beginning of recorded history, absolutely convinced that it is not the end of the story. But now let us look at where they differ, because the differences are just as illuminating as the parallels, and in some ways more so. The most striking difference between the three traditions is in their understanding of what the afterlife actually is. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife was, in a profound sense, a continuation of life. The field of reeds, Aru, was not a radically different state of being. It was a better, more perfect version of earthly life, green and fertile, with family, with music, with the pleasures of a well-lived life, but without death, without disease, without suffering. The dead ate and drank. They were clothed and sheltered. They played music and enjoyed company. It was life but eternal. This is why the Egyptians were so focused on the body. The body needed to be preserved because the self needed a body, not just in this life but in the next one. The ba could fly, yes, but it needed to come home to the mummy at night. The ka needed offerings of real food. The afterlife was embodied, material, continuous with earthly life. For the Romans, the picture was more complicated and more varied. The official Roman afterlife, particularly in its earlier pre-Greek influence form, was somewhat gray and undifferentiated. The manes existed in a shadowy realm beneath the earth, receiving the offerings of the living, but not clearly enjoying the pleasures of the living. It was the philosophical and mystery traditions that supplied more vivid afterlife imagery, Elysium for the virtuous, Tartarus for the wicked, the possibility of reincarnation in Orphic thought, the Epicurean insistence that there was no afterlife at all, only the cessation of sensation. The Roman tradition, in other words, was pluralistic. It did not insist on one answer. It held many answers in creative, sometimes contradictory tension. For the ancient Chinese, particularly in the Confucian tradition, the afterlife was not the primary focus. What mattered was not what happened to the individual soul after death, but what happened to the family across generations. The afterlife was important primarily insofar as it affected the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead, the ancestor's capacity to protect and bless the family's capacity to nourish and honor the ancestor. The individual soul's ultimate fate, in Confucian thought, was less important than the moral quality of the relationships the individual had sustained in life. What persisted after death was not so much the individual as the bond, the love between parent and child, the loyalty between generations, the accumulation of virtue in a family line. This is a fundamentally relational understanding of what survives death. Not the individual soul, exactly, but the love that connected the individual to others. The network of care and obligation that makes a family, and by extension a society, possible. There is something profound in this, and something that speaks to a very modern spiritual hunger. In a world that has largely abandoned the traditional religious frameworks for understanding death, but that has not lost the grief, the love, the desperate need to believe that those we love are not simply gone, the ancient Chinese understanding offers something quietly radical. What persists is the relationship, the love. The bond that was real in life remains real in some form after death. If we tend it, if we honor it, if we refuse to pretend it has ended. I want to say something now that goes beyond history, beyond anthropology, beyond the academic framing that I have tried so hard to avoid in this conversation. These death rituals are not just about the dead, they are about the living. They are, in a profound sense, for the living, structured ways of processing grief, maintaining identity, sustaining community, and orienting the living toward what matters. Think about the Egyptian weighing of the heart. Yes, it is a theology of judgment. But what does it do for the living? It says your moral choices matter. The way you treat others matters. The degree to which you live in alignment with truth, with Ma'at, shapes not just your life, but your eternity. The weighing of the heart is, among other things, a motivational framework. It says, live well because you will be judged and the judgment will be just. Think about the Roman parentalia. Yes, it is a duty to the dead. But what does it do for the living? It creates once a year a mandatory pause. A 9-day period in which the entire city stops its ordinary business and turns its attention toward those who came before. It says, you did not come from nowhere. You are the product of a chain of lives stretching back further than you can see. The dead made you possible. Honor that. Think about the Chinese ancestral shrine. Yes, it is a house for the ancestor's spirit. But what does it do for the family? It keeps the dead present in the daily life of the living, not as a burden or a haunting, but as a presence, a continuity, a reminder that the family is not just the people currently alive, it is a line of love and obligation reaching back through generations and forward into the future. The children who will make offerings at your tablet after you are gone, the grandchildren who will speak your name. Ritual does not just manage grief, it transforms it. It takes the raw, overwhelming experience of loss, the moment when someone you love stops existing in the way they existed before, and gives it shape, meaning, containment. It says, your grief is not meaningless. Your dead are not gone. This loss is part of a larger story, and the story is one in which love persists. We have largely lost this in the contemporary world. Our funerals are shorter. Our mourning periods are compressed. Most people in the modern West are expected to return to work within a week of a major bereavement. Our relationship with the dead is private, individual, largely unstructured by shared ritual. And I think we are the poorer for it. Ancient Egypt, Rome, and China, for all their differences, all understood something that we are still trying to relearn. The dead need us, and we need them. And the ritual attention we give to the boundary between life and death is not a waste of time. It is one of the most important things we do. I want to close this part of our conversation with something that I believe is the beating heart of everything we have explored today. Across Egypt, Rome, and China, across 3,000 years of history, one conviction recurs so persistently that it can no longer be dismissed as cultural quirk or primitive superstition. It must be taken seriously as a form of knowledge. The conviction is this: love is stronger than death. The Egyptians expressed it in the myth of Osiris, the god of the dead himself, who was killed by his brother Set, dismembered, and then reassembled and resurrected through the love and magic of his wife Isis. The resurrection of Osiris was not just a myth about a god. It was a template, a promise. This is what love can do. Love can gather the scattered pieces. Love can speak the name. Love can bring back what death has taken. Not unchanged, not exactly as it was, but real and present, and alive in a new form. The Romans expressed it through the persistence of the manes, the continuing presence of the dead in the life of the family, in the stones of the forum, in the masks of the ancestors carried at funerals. The dead were not gone. They were woven into the fabric of Rome itself. The city was not just the living, it was the living and the dead together, in a single community bound by memory, by love, by the obligations of kinship. The Chinese expressed it through every morning and evening that a family member stood before the ancestral tablet, bowed, and offered incense. Through every Qingming when families climbed the hills to clean the graves. Through the whole architecture of filial piety, which is, when you strip away the philosophical language, a theology of love, the belief that the love between parent and child is so fundamental, so deep, so constitutive of what it means to be human, that death cannot simply erase it. Love is stronger than death. That conviction, that hope, is one of the oldest things in us. It predates every religion we can name. It predates writing. It predates civilization. It is in the Neanderthal graves discovered in the Shanidar cave in what is now Iraq, where the dead were buried with flowers. It is in the ochre-painted bones of Homo sapiens found in South Africa in burials over 70,000 years old. We have always done this. We have always refused to believe that the people we love simply stop. We have always found ways through ritual, through story, through the careful, loving preparation of the dead for whatever comes next, to insist that the relationship continues. And here is the question that I leave you with. Not a theological question exactly, or not only that, a question about what it means to be alive. When you stand at the edge of death, when you look at it clearly without flinching, as the ancient Egyptians and Romans and Chinese looked at it every day of their lives, what do you believe? What does your heart say? Is death the end of the story, or is it a doorway? The ancients believed it was a doorway. Every civilization we have looked at today built its entire spiritual architecture around that belief. They put their best minds on it, their greatest artists, their most sophisticated theologians. They spent enormous resources, labor and wealth and creativity and love preparing for that doorway, navigating it, honoring those who had passed through it. They were not afraid of death in the way we are. Or rather, they were afraid, but they had something to do with the fear. They had ritual. They had theology. They had a community of the living and the dead bound together in a web of obligations and love that stretched in both directions across the boundary of mortality. We can learn from that. Not necessarily by adopting their specific beliefs or practices, though some of us might find something living and real in them, but by recovering the attitude, the orientation, the willingness to face death and take it seriously and not look away. Because the door we are all going through eventually, inevitably, may be the most important one we ever open. That is where I will leave us today, in the doorway, looking at what the ancient world believed was on the other side. If this conversation has moved you, if you found yourself thinking differently about death, about ritual, about the relationship between the living and the dead, I want you to know that this is exactly what First Beliefs is here to do. This channel exists to take you into the deep history of human spiritual life, to sit with the big questions, to refuse the easy answers. We have so much more to explore together. We have not even touched the death rituals of ancient Mesopotamia, the civilization that came before Egypt, that gave us the first written stories, including the first great story of grief, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have not talked about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which may be the most detailed map of the dying process ever written. We have not talked about the Norse concept of Valhalla or the Zoroastrian Tower of Silence, which, as a Persian woman, I have a very personal connection to, and which I cannot wait to explore with you in a future episode. There is so much ahead. So here is what I am asking you to do right now. If you are watching on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. This kind of content is not promoted by the algorithm the way that other content is. The only way First Beliefs grows is through your direct support, your choosing to come back, you're sharing this with people in your life who are asking the same big questions you are. If this episode spoke to you, please leave a comment below. Tell me which of these 3 civilizations resonated with you most. Tell me what you believe happens after death. Tell me a ritual that matters to you, something you do to honor your own dead, or something you wish you did. These conversations in the comment section are some of the most meaningful exchanges I have, and I read every single one. If you're listening on a Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, thank you for being here. Please subscribe on your platform and please leave a rating and review. It takes 30 seconds and it makes an enormous difference in helping new listeners find this content. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to explore more of the sacred history that underlies the world we live in, the back catalog of this channel is full of episodes just like this one. ancient Zoroastrianism, the Book of Enoch, the mystery of reincarnation across the world's religions, the flood myths that appear in over 200 cultures independently across the entire span of human history. The door is open. Come through it. I will see you in the next episode. And until then, speak the names of those you love, living and dead alike. Because as the ancient Egyptians understood 3,000 years before us, as long as the name is spoken, the soul is not gone. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.